several years running this ceremony, and I've kind of grabbed the torch and ran with it from Jerry, but without him, this would just be a kind of a side note. I've always felt that to remember on the day that it happened and honor everyone that's here is even more important than the reenactment we do, although the reenactment's what everybody comes to see. This is the reason for that. So without Jerry, we probably not sure that we'd be doing this, at least the way that we should. I want to make a note, kind of an editorial comment, we'll say here. As a reenactor, living historian, and this is my 20th year at this particular site. 20 years ago, I was a spectator. I came, I'm like, wow, this is kind of cool. Came on a Saturday. I was already a Civil War reenactor, but Saturday was pretty cool, and a guy grabbed me by the arm and said, hey, you ought to join us. I'm like, oh, I don't have any of this stuff. He goes, that's all right, we'll loan you something. So I was back the next day as a participant, sight unseen other than watching as a spectator. That's the way many of us got involved in this, kind of either as spectators or knowing fellow reenactors that were out here. And I'm proud of every one of them that are here today, but if you'll notice, we're not getting any younger.
Speak for yourself.
Yes, some are just aging well, absolutely. The rest of us, not so much. But I want to add something that gives me some hope for the future. Not only have we brought in some younger reenactors each year, we're working and recruiting. We have Dade's youth that we're working with hand in hand to get some of those teens that are old enough by state standards to come out. But I want to recognize one of those volunteers for double efforts. Tyler McAllister back there in scout uniform. If you'll rise, I'm going to embarrass you for a couple seconds here. Tyler's not only a member of Dade's youth here, and his father and entire family, sister, father, are all active in this. But Tyler did his Eagle project, and the fruits of his labor are right behind me and in front of you, the barricade here, which was in tremendous need of help and rotting. And every few years we have to replace it. And it's kind of a task to go through the state and get the funds, the manpower. He took it upon himself as his Eagle project. And it's guys like Tyler and Dade's youth that really keep this place going. The reenactors are great, and the reenactment's always kind of the focus and the banner event of the year, but this park's here 363 other days of the year as a memorial. And Tyler's work, Dade's youth, CSO, all of these working hand in hand are what allow us to keep doing this. So I wanted to recognize them. Thank you, Tyler. So not only is this a solemn day as we remember the battle, and I'll talk a little bit about what happened there. It's been a solemn year within our ranks as volunteers. Many of us are members not only of the Dade Battlefield Society, but the Seminole Warriors Foundation and other groups that help with history. And this year we lost a couple giants within our ranks as reenactors, historians, and all of the above, because I tend to think that most of us as reenactors are also historians. But the first one we lost earlier in the year, John Griffin, who portrayed a Seminole warrior, but not just a Seminole, but a Black Seminole. His research and bringing his family and his nephew Matt involved has brought another facet of Seminole War history that folks just didn't get to see or hear about unless they met with him. John was a giant in reenacting and a very civic-minded man. We lost him earlier in the year. And then just recently, perhaps the biggest loss that we suffered in the Seminole War community, Mr. Frank Laumer, author, historian, founder of Seminole Warriors Foundation, been on every board there is, holding every position, written literally the books that we use, from Massacre to Dade's Last Command. His research is what created the reenactment here. Between him and Dr. Ray Jerome, decades ago, starting the reenactment, and literally starting with mixed Civil War uniforms and spray painted black paper bag hats just to get guys on the field. Started it all, but it was his research, his efforts that continued on into his 90s. We want to recognize him today, and it's in his honor as well as the soldiers that we conduct this ceremony today. And next week, the reenactment, he will be on our mind as well. So as I alluded to earlier, about this time the battle was wrapping up, or had wrapped up, on December 28, 1835. It was the end of several days of marching that started where Tampa is today, at Fort Brooke. 108 men were marching from Fort Brooke to go to Fort King, where Ocala is today, to relieve the garrison. There was tensions. They knew that some conflict was imminent, and detachments from 3 different units, the 2nd and 3rd U.S. Artillery and the 4th U.S. Infantry, were tasked to march to Fort King to relieve that garrison. Throughout that march, not only did they have the miles to contend with, the chance of hostilities, they had to contend with weather, rain, cold. The average soldier was wearing the uniforms that you see, the light blue uniforms here, also with knapsacks to carry their gear, overcoats to protect from the cold and the rain. So each man carrying roughly 50, 60 pounds, along with the 12-pound weapon. They made that march. They woke up the last morning just a few miles away, just south of here, at an old sinkhole, the round clay sink. They probably did what rations they had left, made some breakfast, got up, stretched around, woke up, formed column, and marched back up from that direction to this way when they hit this area. At this point, after a couple hours on the march, they were stretched out pretty far, these 108 men. If you ever take the walk along this trail and see where the markers are, where the officers fell and the advance guard, and realize that this barricade was more or less the center of the line, and the main gate is pretty much close to where Dade fell, so this shows you the length of that stretched out column. The Seminoles had planned this for days, if not weeks, and picked about the most perfect ground that they could lay for an ambush. So perfect that the ambush is, to this day, studied by the U.S. Armed Forces. Several times a year, me, several other volunteers come out here and do what's called a staff ride, conduct a visit with Army and other military officers to study the ground and study that attack. 184 years later, and they're still studying it. It tells you its relevance to history. The technology changes, but the men and the tactics, oddly enough, stay pretty much the same. That land was perfect because there were vast open areas for clear fields of fire, yet dense underbrush, scrub pine, palmetto, trees. Very similar to these uncut areas right over here. Men can hide very, very easily. When you have a column of men that I won't say was lax, but maybe overconfident, tired, they'd made it a few days without too much incident, so they weren't as prepared. And remember that it was damp and rainy the whole time. These weapon systems they used were flintlocks. Powder gets wet and damp. They don't always work right away. So the advantage was definitely with the Seminoles that were here. On the very first volley fired, they killed Major Dade. So they knew right away who the leaders were. What they didn't count on was the other officers and non-commissioned officers. Captain Gardner, the lieutenants, the sergeants taking over and immediately forming ranks as U.S. regulars were trained to do and return fire. That battle raged for several hours. The reality is that almost half of the command were hit in that first volley. Yet they managed to maintain against, depends on the estimates that you hear, anywhere from 200 to 300 Seminoles. And it continued on. At one point, with a little under half the command, they began building a wood barricade to protect themselves. That this replicates. This is the spot where that occurred. Prior to that, the Seminoles had said, all right, we've done what we want to do. They backed off and formed up in the rear and were getting ready to leave when they began to hear the axes and saws work. And they took that as a sign from the spirits that, oh, look, they're penning themselves up. So they attacked again. The end of that attack, there were 3 survivors. None of the officers were alive, just 3 men. And one of those, Private Ransom Clark, made his way back over several days back to Fort Brooke where they started, and he is the reason why, from his writings and presentations after the war, he's the main reason why we know what happened today. 105 killed out of 108. Staggering at any event. It was the largest loss of life the United States Army had experienced since the American Revolution. It was national news, headline news. Now today, where anybody can pull out their cell phone or have CNN or Fox or whatever news they watch, news is instantaneous. You can actually see the news before it happens. It's so fast nowadays. Back then it took weeks. 4th U.S. Infantry, led by Colonel Foster, came upon the scene several weeks later and saw the carnage, the bodies, and interred the men right here initially within the confines of the barricade. The officers separate from the men. And at the end of the conflict in 1842, they were pulled out and reinterred at what is now the National Cemetery at St. Francis Barracks in St. Augustine. And you can go today and honor them with the pyramids that are there. But it's staggering, and it's very spiritual to me when I come out and realize what's happened on this very ground that we're sitting and standing. The reenactment that we do is as close to reality as we can do with what we have. Thank God we're just firing blanks and not lead projectiles, and we're not experiencing the abject fear, although we try to portray it. It's a play, it's an act, but it's the only and probably best way to show folks the chaos, the fear, the abject terror of war and battle. But then we get to resurrect and rise and shake hands and move on. But for 105 of those men and an unknown number of Seminoles, they did not rise. They did not leave. And I think that's why it's important, and I'm thankful that we are here and able to come here, tell their story, reminisce, see a lovely park, and in the rest of the year have family reunions, barbecues, and other events. But it's no different than any other conflict that we fought in. War is war. Won't get into all the political issues. There's never been a cut and dried war we've ever fought, but the men who were here on both sides, soldiers and warriors, all did an absolute incredible job for their own reasons. And it's very important that we recognize their sacrifices and then go kind of dig into the deeper story, see what caused it, how it happened. And we have an absolutely wonderful place to begin that learning, and it should continue on and on. We'll never know everything, but we know a little bit more with each year as we go.